In this video, we're going to talk about an important concept, intellectual capital. This concept sheds really important light on our professional careers and our career trajectory, so let's get into the details. Hello there and welcome back. I'm Alex Lyon, and if this is the first time tuning into this channel, Communication Coach is here to help rising leaders, probably professionals like you who want to increase your leadership skills so that you can bring out the best in the team that's right around you. And today we're talking about intellectual capital. So first I will contrast this concept with traditional forms of capital, then we'll talk about some of the interesting aspects of it, and then we'll finish the video by talking about some takeaways that you can apply to your professional life. So traditional capital is generally a two-sided equation where we have on one side money and the other side workers. So we have the capitalists on one side that have cash, that own property like factories and the building and the land, other kinds of property, tangible goods. And on the other side of the equation, we have human capital, or in other words, muscle work. So you often see this in an old-fashioned factory where you have the owners and the workers. Nowadays, we live in a new economy, as they say, the information age. And that old equation has really been destabilized in a lot of ways because now people are talking about intellectual capital, social capital, cultural capital, because these terms capture very important aspects of our experience that the old terms don't really address very well. In fact, I have a whole nother video about social capital, and I will put a link to that video in the description below this one, as well as hopefully a pop-out card that should come out right around now. So let's turn now to intellectual capital, and we'll define this a little bit and unpack some of the nuances on it. So intellectual capital is a term that describes when we see knowledge as a resource, knowledge that is used to solve problems, often in industry, knowledge that adds value to an enterprise in some way, that gives an enterprise a strategic advantage. So if your knowledge and expertise solves those kinds of problems, then people will see it as an intellectual capital. Essentially, your knowledge will gain currency. A lot of times we see higher education generally associated with people who we think of as having intellectual capital, like doctors and lawyers and engineers and other people with a higher level of education. But that's because it's taken them so long to learn all of this expertise to solve those problems very quickly that they have those degrees. It doesn't necessarily have to go that way, but you usually do see people talking about intellectual capital in terms of those higher levels of education. It's important to note, though, that your information, knowledge, expertise, any data that you might have is not automatically valuable. There's this issue when we're talking about intellectual capital of perception. In other words, let's say that you are the world's foremost expert on the common housefly. Let me ask you this. Why is your top-level expertise on the housefly valuable? Why should I be willing to pay you for that knowledge and information? Because I'm sure that there are experts out there in all kinds of fields that know what they know and feel passionate about it. But why should I care? What problem does your expertise solve that I can't solve on my own? That's when your expertise, when your knowledge becomes intellectual capital. When your knowledge gains currency, now we're talking about intellectual capital. So why is some knowledge and expertise more valuable in people's perceptions than others? Well, there are three ways, at least three ways, that we see some knowledge as more valuable than others. Three processes or ways that we start to think, oh, that's really important, or we don't care as much about other types of expertise. So let's unpack these three. The first one is the tradition of the context. So let's say you come from a certain country or region or industry or a certain time and place in history. There's a momentum over time that has positioned certain types of jobs and certain types of knowledge and expertise as more valuable than others. So in the United States, we think physicians are really top-notch. If you're a doctor, then wow, that's high status, that's a high-paying job, that's really valuable. If we were to go to India, however, so I'm told, I'm an American, but I'm told in India that if you're an engineer, engineers are seen as having higher status than physicians. In the United States, that's not the case. It's reversed. We would say that a physician has higher status than an engineer. And this shows that Neither one of them is right or wrong, by the way. It's just that the tradition of that context positions one type of expertise above another. So perception matters here. A second way that some expertise is positioned or valued more than others is the importance of the problem that expertise solves. So I am a big fan of science fiction movies, especially alien invasions and wars and things like that. I'm a big fan of Marvel, and here's what I've noticed in a lot of these movies, like especially the alien invasion science fiction movies. Early on in the movie, there's some expert that everybody ignores. They say, oh, what do you know? And then what happens is the aliens actually invade and the science fiction weapons come out. And all of a sudden, this expert that everybody blew off a little while ago now becomes the most important guy because he's the only one that knows how to defeat the aliens. He knows something. He knows some information, some expertise that now is really important. The type of expertise you have will be seen as valuable if it solves an important problem in that context. And of course, contexts change over time. So different knowledge becomes more important or less important over time. And the third way that our knowledge becomes seen as high-level intellectual capital or not is the active perception management by the people in that context. So people get better at explaining why what they know is valuable, or they do something to position it as more valuable. So a dermatologist is a kind of doctor that works on the skin, plainly put. Years ago, a few decades back, dermatologists were not really seen as having high status in the medical community. It was a common type of position. There were lots of dermatologists. And what happened was the dermatologists all got together and they decided very deliberately to limit the number of positions for incoming new dermatologists. So what they did is they manipulated the supply and demand of how many new dermatologists were getting into the system. And then in the future, now there are very few dermatologists compared to the need. So they messed with the supply and demand equation. And nowadays, dermatologists are very highly paid, well deep into the six figures, as highly paid as some surgeons and heart surgeons, but they weren't before. So here's the question. Did their expertise become more valuable naturally, or did they manage the perception of their expertise? They managed their perception. They changed the supply and demand equation, and they now are some of the most prestigious and high status positions available in the medical community. So the importance here is realizing that unlike cash, unlike traditional capital, intellectual capital is subject to perception. You don't see this a lot in the books about intellectual capital out there. I wrote an article about this about 10 years ago in the Western Journal of Communication that talked about how intellectual capital was really more subject to perception than other forms of capital. And so it's a topic that's really important to me. So let's talk about some takeaways for you in your professional life and how you can use this concept to think about your own expertise. The first is that times have changed, and now more than ever, you can get your information, your knowledge, your expertise directly to clients. We live in the information age, and everything you know can reach the world with the touch of a button. All you really need is a laptop and a phone, and you can essentially sell your expertise to a global audience. You don't need a factory anymore. You don't need a big, rich capitalist to get behind you. You don't need a whole lot of equipment. So times have changed, and nowadays your expertise is more valuable than ever. Another takeaway is education. Education becomes very important in this equation. It's one of the fastest and most reliable ways to develop an expertise. So if you haven't already thought about it, you might consider thinking about a master's level degree or above to invest in your expertise. And a third takeaway is that you have to get good at explaining what you do. Your expertise is not going to sell itself any more than the foremost expert on houseflies. That expertise doesn't sell itself. You have to get good at explaining what you know to other people, because if you can explain how your knowledge helps solve an important problem, you're much more likely to get a good and favorable economic exchange. And one last tip on this, and this is more of a caution, be careful, because if you work for a big company, big companies have a reputation for trying to take your expertise and take your knowledge and make it their property instead of yours. Just like in the old days, in the old factories, how they tried to de-skill their workers and have each worker just do one little piece of the assembly line process. Big companies nowadays are trying to capture your knowledge in some ways, capture your expertise in some ways, and that changes the power dynamic, that changes the relationship between the big company and the employee. And you don't want to go back in time and go back to the way it was in the old factory. As someone with expertise, with lots of good knowledge information, you want to stay in the driver's seat and hold on to that expertise in a way that you get a fair exchange. Now that's complicated, there's lots more nuance to that last item, but just keep that in mind. So question of the day, what aspect of this video did you find most interesting about intellectual capital? I would love to hear your comments in that section below the video. And I want to leave by offering you a free resource. I've created a downloadable free PDF with the 7 instant tips to make you a more confident and composed public speaker. I will link that in the description below the video, as well as the first comment in that comment section of the video. So you click on that link, you put in your email, and then I email you those 7 instant tips to becoming a more confident and composed public speaker. So thanks, God bless, and I will see you in the next video.